A new dawn breaks over Egypt, a kingdom of monumental splendor and power. Yet beneath the golden sands and towering pyramids, a shadow looms. The land whispers of a new king's ascent to the throne, a ruler who knows not the stories of Joseph. The king is wary, for the children of Israel have grown numerous and strong, a formidable force within his realm. Welcome back to the Bible Paladin as we begin our study of the book of Exodus. And whether you are new to the channel or are returning, thank you so much for joining me as we dive into this beautiful story.
History became legend. Legend became myth.
And for the series on Exodus, I'll be concluding each episode with a question so that we can continue our conversation. We begin Exodus right where Genesis left off, but we fast forward about 400 years, and so we're reminded of who is in Egypt at this time. And if you forgot how they got to Egypt, you can go back and read the story in Genesis from chapters 37 through 40. And so let's begin with the very beginning of the book of Exodus. So I pray for wisdom as we begin to read these sacred words. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. The story begins with the 12 sons, or tribes, of Israel. In fact, this is the beginning of the promise that God had made to Abraham, and to his son Isaac, and to his son Jacob after him. In fact, this whole first chapter shows how God makes good on that first promise, that of multiple descendants who would fill the land. The second part of the promise then becomes the goal of the rest of the narrative.
Zion. If the war was over tomorrow, Zion's where the party would be.
We're also reminded that the number of those who came to Egypt was 70, which we are also told back in chapter 46 of Genesis. Of course, it would have been most likely much more than 70, for a household included also the wives, the retainers, and servants as well. In fact, as we will be seeing, it is actually the women who are the real heroes at this very beginning of the story of Exodus. And 70 was also a perfect number, being a perfect multiple of the number 7. And so it represented fullness, the fullness of that first promise that God had given his people. And so let's see what happens with all of their descendants. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this, and let the male children live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." After many generations, it no longer matters to the king of Egypt or Pharaoh who Joseph was or what he had done for the kingdom.
Who are you? Why should I care?
That he did not know Joseph could either mean that he was simply unaware of the history or what Joseph had done, or more likely that this was a new dynasty, and whatever perks that Joseph had won for the Hebrews were no longer in effect. As to which pharaoh this was historically, the text does not tell us, but there have been a few suggestions, such as Thutmose II, Ahmes I, or Ramesses or Seti I. This would be the father of the pharaoh who would be the antagonist to Moses. You can view my previous video for more information on the dating of these events. What we do know is that the pharaoh was certainly afraid of the growing number of Israelites. The new king was thinking about his kingdom and how this group of foreigners living within their boundaries could certainly be a threat to them. And of course, ironically, Pharaoh was not wrong.
Single-handedly, you will manage to bring the greatest kingdom on earth to ruin.
He predicts that they will multiply, join the enemies of Egypt, and will escape. And of course, all of this does happen, and the enemy of Egypt ends up being the God of Israel. Pharaoh's first solution was to put them to work in such a way to make their lives miserable. While we often picture them as slaves, and certainly their work would have been like that of slaves, it is unlikely that they were actually owned by anyone, but rather were pressed into service by their government. Remember, when they first arrived in Egypt, they were able to continue to live and be employed as shepherds and herdsmen, caring not only for their livestock, but also that of the Egyptians. Now they were tasked with doing the grunt work in the building of these new cities, in addition to their working in the fields. Often, such work would be seasonal, depending on the flooding of the Nile. This tactic, however, did not seem to diminish their numbers, and so Pharaoh takes it a step further and decides to have all of the Hebrew men or the Hebrew children killed as soon as they are born. Of course, he fails to take into account the faith of the Hebrew people. The midwives would not obey Pharaoh, who was seen as a god to his people, but certainly not to them. Of course, this made Pharaoh's plan backfire because the true God blessed these women with more children, showing that he blesses those who fear him and continues to fulfill his promises. This theme we will see throughout the book. But again, the king of Egypt does not give up, but does something that foreshadows what will eventually befall his own kingdom. He orders that all of the male children be killed outright. The young women then would eventually be assimilated into the Egyptian culture. But if this plan were to work, the Hebrew population would eventually be diminished completely over just the next few generations. But the plan does not work. God hears the cry of his people, and thus begins the story of Moses. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes, and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water." As with many prominent figures in the Bible, we have an infancy narrative for Moses, and it gives us a little bit of background about his upbringing. Yet, for someone who is so important in Judaism, his introduction is remarkably simple. He is a direct descendant of Levi, with both parents being of the same tribe. We find out in chapter 6 that Levi himself is his great-grandfather. If you remember, when Jacob blesses his children, the prophecy for Simeon and Levi seems more like a curse, with the mention of knives, violent rage, and being scattered. And while this certainly may have been referencing what they did to the men of Shechem to avenge their sister, it also may have been a veiled blessing. For as we will see, Moses ends up exiling himself after killing an Egyptian. And then the tribe of Levi becomes the priestly class, whose main role is to offer sacrifice, a job best done with knives. They also will not be given their own land, but rather will be dispersed throughout Israel to exercise their priestly duties. But getting back to the birth of Moses, at first it seems like his introduction indicates that he was the firstborn son, but as we soon find out, he does have an older sister, and as we will find out later, he also has an older brother as well. Of course, Aaron would have been born before this edict to kill all the male children, as he was 3 years older than Moses. Now, God passing over the firstborn and choosing a younger brother seems to be a common pattern. Nevertheless, his mother, Jochebed, successfully hides him for 3 months before realizing that this cannot be sustained. Surely, this is putting their entire family at risk. Finally, she sends him off in a basket, hoping, or should I say, praying for the best. In the movie The Prince of Egypt, I think they do a wonderful job portraying this scene with the sorrow yet trust of his mother as she sends him down the river with Miriam running alongside the shore to make sure he's okay. Although the movie does change quite a bit as it progresses and takes a lot of liberties, I still highly recommend it. There's also something interesting about the words that are used to describe the basket that Moses is put into. The word tevat literally means ark and was also used in Genesis for Noah's boat. Both also were covered with pitch to prevent water from seeping in. The similarities betray the deeper meaning that we find within the text, and that God will use even these circumstances, even the horrible edict of Pharaoh, to bring about his will and his deliverance of his people. And it is ironic that it was Pharaoh's daughter who finds the child, and she might have been childless herself because she felt pity on this child. And that she was bathing in the Nile may have been a sign for her of the God's blessing for this event. The Nile itself was considered to be sacred, the river that provides life, health, and fertility. It was now providing a son for her. The reader, however, knows that it was divine providence that allows this to happen. And then the quick-witted Miriam steps out from behind the bush to see what was going on and to offer a solution. She offers to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby. Of course, they are unaware of her relationship, and she is able to ensure that the family remains together for at least a couple more years until Moses is weaned. We see just in these first couple of chapters that God continues to reward the women who remain faithful to him, despite the intentions of Pharaoh. But finally, Moses is given back to Pharaoh's daughter to raise him in the royal household. In Acts of the Apostles, St. Stephen states that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was powerful in his words and deeds. The Jewish historians Philo and Josephus also both talk about the great education that Moses would have received by the Egyptians.
It's spectacular, spared no expense.
Even in the house of his enemies, Moses was being prepared to be the leader and the lawgiver that God had destined him to be. Before continuing, just a few comments on the name of Moses. As in with many biblical names, we are given a name that sounds similar to many of the words surrounding certain events during the infancy narrative. Yet here it's interesting that it is not the mother of Moses who names him, but rather the one who adopted him. And we are told that it is based on a Hebrew word similar to that for to draw out. Most likely it had an Egyptian etymology, which means that this may have not been Moses' full name, because Mosi was typically an Egyptian suffix that would oftentimes be connected to a specific god. It meant to be born of. For example, Thutmose would mean Thoth is born, or born of Thoth, and Ramesses would mean is born of Ra. For obvious reasons, if his name were dedicated to an Egyptian god, it would make sense that it would be shortened in Hebrew. As you may have noticed, the story moves pretty quickly, so we're going to fast forward about 40 years to when Moses was an adult, and see what happens. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely this thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well. As we've stated before, there are a number of Jewish extra-biblical traditions that indicate what Moses may have been doing during this time until he was an adult, such as his education and military service. But here in the scripture and the text, all we have is from the time he was born until this time and when he witnesses one of his kinsmen being treated poorly. He may have been shielded from their plight in the palace, even though it would not have been a secret concerning his own ethnic heritage. What tips his righteous anger is seeing one of the Egyptian taskmasters striking a Hebrew. And the sacred author does not hide the fact that what happens next was no accident. Moses looks around for witnesses before he strikes him, and then he hides the body. But now that Moses was aware of the oppression of his kinsmen, it seems that he is beginning to weigh his options, because he goes back the very next day to once again see what's going on. What was he hoping to see? What was he hoping to do? But it soon becomes apparent that the murder from the day before is already known and will soon get back to Pharaoh. Knowing that despite his privilege of being raised with royalty, he was still a Hebrew, and he would have to face the consequences if he remained. So Moses flees and ends up in Midian, where he finds a well to refresh and rest. So what do we know about Midian? Remember, Abraham's second wife, Keturah, was a Midianite, and so they were a Semitic people, and they had special ties to the Israelites. Ironically, it was also Midianite traders who bought Joseph from his brothers generations prior and sold him to the Egyptians, which got them all into this mess. While the main or central location of Midian is believed to be east of the Gulf of Aqaba, they were a nomadic people, so could have had settlements throughout the Sinai Peninsula as well, and this would have been a safe place for Moses to go, not only to be with a kindred people, but also away from the Canaanites in the north. And of course, he ends up at a well. Remember what happened at wells in the stories of the patriarchs? Well, let's keep reading and find out. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and saved them and watered their flock. When they came home to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you have come home so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him, that he may eat bread." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter, Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have become a sojourner in a foreign land." There is so much to be said about this passage, but let's begin with Reuel. He is called here a priest of Midian. Now the Midianites also worship Adonai and appear at this time to have a version of the priesthood, making sacrifices to the one true God. And he has 7 daughters. There's that perfect number again. I'm really getting Melchizedek vibes from this guy. And he will, like Melchizedek, perform a fleeting yet important role in this story. His daughters are at the well watering the flock. Even today, with some Bedouin tribes of the Sinai Peninsula, it is the duty of the unmarried women to take the flocks to pasture. And when they're being harassed by the shepherds, Moses once again steps up and helps those who are being oppressed. And it seems like this was a common occurrence for these women, because even Reuel was surprised that they came home so early. Normally they would have had to have waited there by the well until all the other shepherds were finished before watering the flock themselves. And then what happens? Well, when they approach their father and tell him about the incident, they refer to Moses as an Egyptian, which is understandable based on his dress or his accent being raised in an Egyptian household. However, Reuel gets upset with them because they did not invite him back to his home, because he still wants them to offer hospitality, even to this foreigner. He wants to invite him and break bread with him, just as Melchizedek had offered bread and wine when he hosted Abraham. Reuel, too, was also inviting Moses to something greater. He was offering him refuge and also a new beginning, at least for now. But there is one more detail about this story. Remember that Moses met these women at a well.
Great place to meet chicks.
Totally.
Yes, it seems that marriage with one of these women was inevitable. So Moses stays and lives with this tribe and marries one of the daughters, Zipporah. And yet somehow Moses knew that this was not his happily ever after. He gave their son a name that means a stranger, a foreigner here. So he never really sees himself as a true member of the clan. He has a greater purpose, and it's not in Midian. We'll stop here even though there are a few more verses to this chapter, because it sets up the next part of our story. And this seems to be a better break than the chapter division that was added later. But let's see what we can take from the story so far. What really strikes me as I read this story again is the courage and steadfast faith of the women that we see. First, we have the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, who are basically told to abort any male babies as soon as they emerge from their womb, making it look like a stillbirth. But they refuse. This is contrary to the God of life, and so they lie to Pharaoh to get out of the punishment by telling him that the Hebrew women are too strong. They give birth before we even get there. So how does the Lord deal with them? He blesses them for their courage and their tenacity. Then we have the mother of Moses and his sister, as well as Pharaoh's daughter. Jochebed hides Moses as long as she could, but then has the strength to give up her child twice while trusting in the Lord's care over him. It's possible that her and Miriam planned to set Moses off in the basket just at the right time and place, so that this little ark would be swept up into the royal pools alongside the river, just as the women were bathing. And Pharaoh's daughter had pity on the Hebrew child. Then Miriam approaches the Egyptian princess to ensure that she will be able to bring her brother home. While these women are not mentioned as often in sermons or commentaries or portrayed as prominently in art as the men are, they are so instrumental in God's plan for Moses and his people, and God blesses them abundantly, yet quietly. What can we learn from these women? So often the manner in which we follow the Lord, the way in which you follow the Lord, can have an unnoticed and even unexpected impact.
All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
But be assured, God is smiling on you. So as we wrap up today, here's my question for you. Who in your life has been instrumental in your faith journey? And so as we continue this conversation, I look forward to next time as we continue reading the book of Exodus. Until then, work for justice, and God bless.